Peter Coffer here, back with another episode. This is all things music, and you know I love to do this history stuff, right? And I'm really excited about doing this. I've been thinking about and working on this one for weeks now, but disco is alive and well, and everybody, I mean, it's a much maligned, particularly from boomers, genre, but hey, disco's all over the radio today, and disco never died. I know, hey, that disco died in the late 70s. No, it didn't. A lot of people are doing disco, but it was just under a different name. So disco, it comes out of the, it's unique in that it comes out of the LGBTQ community, the Latino community, and the black community. And it was, it's the first really kind of genre or cultural phenomenon, which is biracial, and and these marginal groups got together, and in the early 70s, and it's the LGBTQ is more credited for this, and we'll get into that, having a bigger influence initially because until the early 70s when disco came out, you went to a club, there's a live band, and two things going on here. Number one, in pretty much every big city in the U.S. in the late 60s, same-sex couples could not dance together on the dance floor in clubs. And so the LGBTQ community found their own places in the legal clubs, so to speak, to have their parties at. And it ended up being pretty... a lot of innovation and pretty revolutionary because they were throwing these parties together at different places. It wasn't feasible to bring in a band, and so this is where the idea of the DJ was came from, and the DJs turned the turntables into instruments, and at least for a while, the DJ, in disco, I mean, was the first time where the DJ really became prominent, and sort of, in the early days of disco, the DJs were the what's the word I'm looking for? They were the stars, and of course, then the DJ moved on into hip hop, and hip hop did a totally different thing, with the DJ. But so that's kind of where disco came from. So disco came out of New York City for the most part. Usually it was about happy topics, disco, and a lot of disco fans, say it was escapism. Because, I mean, the late 60s rock scene was pretty heavy, I mean, in politics, and funk at the time could even, in the early 70s, and through the 70s could be kind of heavy on the politics at the time. I mean, look at the early funkadelic stuff, and again, funk is not, there's a whole funk rock element to funk, and so, the early funkadelic stuff was funky, but it was very rock. But it could be dark at times. So, disco brought the fun back, and, and as I said, if you go back to my funk episode, I mean, funk was about celebration too, but disco was all about celebration. They're like, hey, let's just, forget the world, because the 70s, as I've said earlier, was kind of a strange decade. I mean, you had, we're dealing with inflation now. It was the first real big time dealing with inflation. There was the OPEC oil embargo. It was just a weird decade, a lot of strange things. And I think I've said before, if you go back to season 1 to Level Up, the post-pandemic, to me, is kind of like, on bad days, it's kind of the 60s with just kind of all kinds of crazy shit happening. And then on the good days, in 2022 and 2021, there's still weird shit going on. You're just like, what the hell is that? And that's kind of the 70s aspect of it, of today for me. So just to recap, going back to my funk episode, the differences between funk and disco. There's a lot of similarities. Let's start with the similarities, and then they both loved using the chicken scratch guitar. Think Kiss by Prince, Super Bad by James Brown. We'll say Good Times by Chic, even though, Chic is considered, and I'll get to this later, a disco band, but Good Times is a funk song. But, hey, the disco DJs were wearing out Good Times as well. So, Chic stands in both worlds. Le Freak, again, that chicken scratch. Funk song, but again, it was tearing up the disco floors too in the late 70s when it dropped. And then, the bass, whether a finger popping bass, the fat bass, slap bass, so disco and funk share that. The difference is, the funk is on the one, and I talk about that a lot in my funk episodes. So if you want to, I'm not going to go over that because there's a lot of, misconceptions and stuff about what the one is. But, so the funk is on the one and disco is 4 to the floor. And so the other thing that, I didn't mention in the funk episode, but I have to bring up here as far as differences between funk and disco is disco, they worked the strings. It was very orchestral, whereas funk was a lot more stripped down. James was all about stripping it down. And then sometimes it was, it literally was a full-on orchestra in some of those disco songs. So, you're dancing, but it's kind of dreamy and because of those strings. And really, funk never, Rick James, and what I'll call in the future episode, the third generation of funk, really kind of borrowed the strings from disco and perfected it. I think nobody in popular music has done strings as well as Rick James and as frequently as Rick James. For me, the strings, that's Rick's signature. When I think Rick James, I think strings. And, that comes out of the disco scene. So going back to the blending of genres, Chic. So dance, dance, dance. And just to rehashing a little bit from funk, dance, dance, dance is disco. I Want Your Love is disco. Le Freak and Good Times are funk, but heavy rotation on disco radio stations back in the day and in the disco techs. Another group that really, in my opinion, straddled both was Casey and the Sunshine Band. Now, if you go and, by the way, I remember disco as kind of when I came to age and as a kid and started, hearing music and liking music for the first time. So, I lived through disco. But most people consider Casey and the Sunshine Band a disco band. And Casey considers himself, because he's, if you go on YouTube and look at, watch a lot of the disco documentaries, he's on there. But look, Casey's funk too. And I don't, his big dance hits, he wasn't going forward to the floor. Casey was, he was a funk guy, but he just, to be blunt about it, he could make more money, making disco songs. As much as I love funk, disco in its heyday, you would make more money if you were a disco artist. Now, it went boom and bust pretty quickly, but you made more money being a disco artist in the late 70s than being a funk artist. Just bottom line. But for the record, Casey and the Sunshine Band, his horn section was wicked and could, hang with any of the funk horn sections. he's sort of in you can group in there with the majority of the funk horn sections and how he used his horns. James uses horns differently, and I'm gonna do a trios coming up on Level Up with Sly and P Funk, James and George, and then but James used his horns in a very unique way, different than everybody else. But but as far as the majority of people and how they used their horns, Casey and the Sunshine Band is right there with him. Some of those horn lines are just straight wicked and could, I wouldn't be surprised if Earth, Wind and Fire and the Commodores and Kool and the Gang were kind of like, yeah, let's borrow that horn line from Casey and the Sunshine Band. And while we're at it, I forgot to put them on the list. Kool and the Gang. I mean, definitely a funk band, but Open Sesame was on the Saturday Night Fever soundtrack. And so, funk band who got a lot of play on the disco floor. So, as I just mentioned a couple minutes ago, maybe not a couple minutes ago, maybe a minute ago, I'm going to be doing the trios with James Brown, Sly, and George Clinton. But, I mean, if you had, most people, when they talk about it, the Mount Rushmore of funk, everybody puts James Brown there. They put Sly there. They put George Clinton. They put Bootsy. And, of course, Bootsy played bass with James and then went to P-Funk and George, but also did his solo stuff. Very interesting because, it could be argued that Sly Stone is, not only is he one of the forefathers of funk or one of the founders of funk, he's also the founder of disco. Sly had this very interesting classic album, and I believe it came out in 1970. There's a riot going on. And what was unique about that album is Sly used he did the album all by himself for the most part. He brought other band members in for vocals and background vocals and stuff, and sharing lead vocals with him. But I think in that, if not the whole album, most of that album is done with a drum machine. And I say that because disco adopted the drum machine very early on, like 73, 74, 75. And funk and R&B did not adopt the drum machine until the late 70s, 78 and really 79. And so that's another distinctive feature of disco. And, some of the black boomers, derisively say, well, disco didn't use real drums. Well, whatever. I mean, how I am with the funk, but hey, it's all about setting yourself apart. I mean, Prince got used, I think talked about this in my, Prince branding episode, but he got rid of, he totally got rid of, again, going back to the Minneapolis sound, what does it consist of? Drum machines, totally getting rid of, the drums, which, I think he did some overdubs, and I think Sexuality and the Controversy album, but the rest of that album was all drum machine. And that's the first album that's that, R&B funk album that's totally, like that. And he also got rid of the horns and the real horns and used synthesizer brass patches instead of horns. And Prince did that. Number one, it was cheap. Number two, he wanted to set himself apart from everybody else when it came to sound. And then, disco going to the drum machine did that. It set, it gave it a distinct difference than funk. So I talked earlier about how, disco created the DJ. And the other thing that really, that disco started and that hip hop picked up on was this term called crate digging. And so the disco DJs would go to the record stores and look for obscure, songs or records, used ones with great, I was going to say riffs, but I'm in the rock and roll mode. Grooves, that's the word I'm looking for. And as I said earlier, disco really pioneered longer songs and what became known as the 12-inch and extended remixes. So they would take a song and find a good 20 or 30 seconds of it and just play it, for 10, 20 minutes, and then, put stuff over it and do other interesting stuff. But that groove would go on and on and on. And that, they did that, they found these songs by crate digging, and that's what hip hop DJs started doing, and hip hop acts in the early 80s. They did a lot of crate digging to find those obscure beats that they could use in their music. So, but the main, we're getting, I'm sprinkling in little, aspects of where the disco sound comes from. But, the established, places where disco really drew on was from Motown and the Philadelphia International acts. And so we know who the Motown acts are, but in case you don't know, the Stylistics, the OJs, and the Harold Melvin and the Blue Notes. So those were the Philly International sounds, and very smooth, until Rick James, and the Temptations in the 70s, particularly when when the Temptations, they had the, when Stevie got, more creative freedom, after recording 4 albums, like, Release These Arm Walking, and Marvin got, creative freedom from Berry Gordy. The Temptations did as well, and so they were a little rougher, with their in the early 70s. The Temptations did some great psychedelic funk. So yeah, but those are the main influences coming out of the music scene that preceded disco. And piggybacking off of that, so the first 4 to the Floor song is credited with To the Love I Lost by Harold Melvin and the Blue Notes. So that's the first instance of 4 to the Floor. Now, the other interesting aspect that disco did that really has not happened since, disco was a huge underground phenomenon in New York City in the early 70s. And what was very interesting about disco is, DJs would fall in love with certain records and would play them, in the clubs, and people were like, well, what record is that? And the DJ would tell them, and they would go to their record stores and buy these records. And so Billboard started noticing they had songs now on the charts, in the, maybe not obviously top 20, but you have songs sitting around 85 that had no radio play. And then so record labels started like, well, why? I never heard this song. They just sold 50,000 singles in New York City last week. What the hell's going on? And that's kind of when disco got when the labels first, got wind of disco, because they were getting into the bottom half of the top 100 with no radio play whatsoever. And that had never happened before. It has not really happened since, to my knowledge. I can't think of anything offhand. Maybe early hip hop. I don't think. I'm going back, I did the episode on Rapper's Delight. When I was in Columbus, Ohio, they did not, the WVKO, the black radio station, not play Rapper's Delight. No, in Indianapolis, I doubt if the WTLC at the time in the late 70s, I'm pretty sure Indianapolis had one black radio station, and I'm pretty sure they did not play Rapper's Delight. So early hip hop, it was like that too, and was word of mouth. But Again, we're talking early 70s, before Rapper's Delay and, this phenomenon bubbling up out of disco. So what were kind of like the highlights of the disco era? Well, Studio 54. I mean, it was only open for 3 years, 1977 and 1980, but I mean, the stories there coming out of that place, it was the hippest place. It may be the most famous club in music history. I mean, I can't speak for Europe or, London or Paris, but certainly the U.S. I mean, CBGB's for the punk scene. You got the Whiskey Go-Go, breaking bands out of, Los Angeles in the 60s and even through the 80s. I mean, the Doors came through the Whiskey the Go-Go, Motley Crue came through Whiskey the Go-Go. I'm sure other groups, but those just come to mind. And obviously the Fillmore East and West, but those were more live venues. So, I mean, but Studio 54 is right there with those four landmark clubs. And just the stories. And, hey, there's a movie on Studio 54, and there are whole documentaries on Studio 54 alone. The other high point of or highlight from the disco era, a lot of great acts, but the biggest one was the Bee Gees, and the Bee Gees were a blessing and a curse, in many ways for disco, because Saturday Night Fever just blew up, and classic album, and the Bee Gees were great songwriters, and even after the fall of disco and whatever, the Bee Gees wrote a incredible amount of songs for many acts through the 80s, 90s, 2000s. Country, cross genres, just great songwriters. But the Bee Gees were so good, 78, 79, and 80. More 78, 79, and they think 74, You Should Be Dancing. I think that was 74 or 75. That's kind of when their disco phase started. Before that, they were kind of like, the Australian Beatles, but they were such good songwriters that, you can't, and they had a lot of hits, and, when they were in that mode. So you can't really, call them Beatles ripoffs because they were just that good of songwriters. But I mean, in 77, 78, 79, the Bee Gees just had an incredible run of singles, and they just owned the radio. I mean, just to be blunt about it. I mean, they had Saturday Night Fever, and in the middle of that, they dropped a Spirits Haven't Flown album. They had a bunch of hits, so they, simultaneously, even as the radio was still playing Saturday Night Fever, even though I think it was 12 months later when they dropped Spirits Haven't Flown. And, people just got tired of them. People were not used to it. I mean, it's interesting because, in the 60s with the Beatles released, 64, 65, they released like 3 or 4 albums, or multiple albums those years, and people were used to that back then. But then, by the early 70s, the model shifted. One album per year. We don't want to oversaturate it. And the Bee Gees were just so damn good that in that 78, 79 run that they got oversaturated, and people got tired of them, and people were, the other thing is, the classic rock and those folks were threatened by the, disco, and some of them, admit that, in these disco documentaries on YouTube. I mean, they were like, oh, we can't, and what killed classic rock? I mean, they didn't see, they saw disco coming, but they didn't see grunge coming. But they thought that they saw disco, but they didn't see grunge. And now in the streaming era, we're back to that 64, 65 model where, I mean, Drake will drop 2 albums a year, and he'll come out with a new single every 2 or 3 months, whether it's him just doing singles by himself, or doing, being on other people's songs and other records. So, people now are used to, literally, you know, having a new Drake song every few months. They weren't, used to that in 78, 79. And so, at least for some artists, they can, they're back to that mode where they can, essentially continuously release music, and that's accepted now. Interesting topic about the cover now. Was disco political? And it's interesting because at the end of one of the documentaries of on disco on YouTube, all the disco guys said no, 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 we were not political, but disco was pretty political. I mean, even though it's fun music and escapism, first of all, it came from the LGBTQ community, and that's radical in itself, and it really, I mean, going back to single or same-sex couples can't dance. I mean, that was why that the Stonewall riot came out of that. I mean, the New York police raided Stonewall because same-sex couples were dancing. So and then because of Stonewall, they went off and did their own things in their own clubs. So that just disco's coming out of the LGBT community in itself is political. You also, I mean, you had the Village People, which, I mean, it was campy, but I mean, that was like as gay as you could get. And I mean, come on, listen. We'll just go look at the lyrics of YMCA. Fun but subversive, and great artists have used have done a lot of subversive things under the guise of fun over the years. I mean, Richard Pryor, George Carlin. I mean, make you laugh, but man, some of the knowledge they be dropping is deep. And disco was a little like that. And then this whole thing of disco's approach to the sexuality. I mean, the late 60s had free love, and disco was free love without the politics. And I forget, in one of the documentaries on YouTube, they talk about, Studio 54 was decadent. Disco had decadent aspects in these clubs, but it was political because, some of that decadence, was rooted in, the LGBTQ community and the sex acts that they performed. The other thing is, back to sex is it was a pretty, I mean, you look at the lyrics to, in disco and stuff, and even the males, the male singers, I mean, it was pretty woman-centric and pretty woman-friendly. I mean, it wasn't like, I'm going to do this to her, I'm going to do this to you, It's like, oh yeah, my baby likes that, or, it was a different vibe, and there was, women were, a lot of the disco songs were treated, were kind of seen as equal to males, and a lot of the songs, the woman's sexuality and her wants and needs were raised up above the male. And disco, I mean, compared to classic rock and even funk now, thinking about it, I mean, Donna Summer's the queen of disco, but you had Gloria Gaynor. I mean, you had a lot of women, doing stuff, as artists in disco. And, I mean, we're in an era in hip-hop right now where, particularly black female artists are expressing themselves sexually. I mean, the most famous is WAP, but, got Megan Thee Stallion and all these other acts doing their thing. But who did it first? Donna Summer, Love to Love You Baby. 20 minutes. I mean, there's a lot of why disco. Just go listen to that 20-minute version of "Love to Love You, Baby." A lot of reason, a lot of the innovations of disco are contained in that one song. I mean, it's a woman taking control of her sexuality. It's 20 minutes long. It ain't 3 minutes and 30 seconds like today, or you know, 2 minutes and 45 seconds or 2 minutes and 30 seconds like top 40 radio in the 60s. And so yeah, I mean that's those are the innovations of and yes, disco was very political. And the reason, the disco sucks movement that, culminated in the disco demolition, the burning of the records at Comiskey Park in Chicago, the White Sox, my team, the White Sox, not Bill Veck's best idea, but that, I mean, if they're burning your records, it's political. They're burning them for a reason. I mean, it was anti Latino, brown people, anti-black, and anti-LGBTQ. I mean, that's what that boils down to. And they were, disco was a real threat to the supremacy of classic rock at the time. And so they went in there guns blazing and went after it. And hey, I did a whole episode on the rise and fall of rock and roll, so I'm a rock and roll fan, but I'm just calling it like I see it. So criticisms of disco, there are a lot of one-hit wonders in disco, and there's a lot of what you would call studio bands, like thrown together, and then, let's, Dick Clark wants this band. It's not really a band. Let's throw together something that looks like a band. And then one of the, criticisms of disco from particularly black boomers is that disco's watered down funk and R&B. I wouldn't, I mean, I talked about the similarities between the two, and yeah, I mean, disco's a softer, in general, a softer variety of dance than funk, but I think they complement each other, and there's a lot of acts that, I already talked about Casey and the Sunshine Band, Kool and the Gang, Chic, and a lot of others who had their feet in both worlds, and so I think they complement each other. I think they're both great genres. There's a lot of synergy and exchange of ideas between the two. I mean, George Clinton's on one of the disco talking about his love for disco. So yeah, I mean, but in its heyday from 75 to 79. You made more money as a disco artist than you did as a funk artist, and funk was about keeping it pure and keeping it real and keeping it in the streets. I mean, disco went mainstream, and people, when we talk about the downfall of disco, I mean, the Bee Gees' popularity, the double-edged sword there. But, the record company saw money and they started putting out a lot of really bad disco stuff. And in the late, towards the end there in 78, 79. You never had that phenomenon with funk, because funk just was not the financial juggernaut that disco became. So finally, the Children of Disco, part A of the Children of Disco, the genres. New Wave borrowed a lot from disco, particularly their uses of, very synth-driven, and with the rise of synthesizers, disco became very, very synth-heavy as well. So the how disco used this, they went from real strings to towards the end, some synth strings and mixed the real, and some of them, but a lot of them still used real orchestras. But in many ways, the new wave artists, kind of used the synthesizer strings and mimicked what the disco artists were trying to do. And so in many ways, punk is the mirrored or new wave is the marriage of punk and disco. So it's like, hey, let's take some of the edges of punk off and then throw that, that disco or orchestral stuff on, but we're using synthesizers. We don't have the money to pay. We're still punk. We're not going to pay for the Philharmonic Orchestra to do the strings. We'll just use these synthesizers to do it. So that's part of the legacy of disco. And the other one is obviously electronic dance music, because, the 4 to the floor drum beat is almost synonymous. I'm not going to say every house and trance and techno song use 4 to the floor, but most of them do, and that comes out of disco. And all of those genres, maybe at some point I'll do EDM, I don't know, but the mothers and fathers of EDM would be kind of like Art of Noise. Oh, jeez, I'm thinking of the song now. Kraftwerk and disco. That's really, the mothers and fathers of EDM. And so that's part of disco's legacy. And then the second part of disco's children are artists. And if I'm not mistaken, Madonna arrives in New York City in 1979. So this is right after the downfall, the implosion of disco under the name disco. Madonna's, first big song was Everybody, and Madonna broke the same way those early disco artists. She recorded a song, she did a single, she got DJs to play it, and she bubbled up through the club scene in New York City. Got noticed that way because, she started moving units out of New York City, and that's how she got signed. Madonna's a disco artist. Even, early stuff is essentially, disco new wave. And then, as I, talk about in Hollywood, by the time you get to the early 90s with the erotic album, she's bringing in EDM. So Madonna's always been, a disco-rooted artist. And it's interesting, you got Duran Duran. There was still a lot of disco going on in the 80s. They just didn't call it disco because it was kind of a bad word. You got Lady Gaga and The Weeknd. Come on. His stuff, he basically uses the classic, high singing R&B, Michael Jackson, who, his big idol, Luther Vandross, Eldebarge, that kind of singing style, with either disco or new wave. Blinding Lights is a new wave song with sort of, I don't know what it's a kind of I don't know what the beat would be. It's I guess, a new disco-ish kind of beat, but most, and he has another song on this last album that is straight disco. It's just like disco with a newer drum machine, and but the point I'm getting at is there's a lot of just straight up disco being played right now, and it's ironic that the metalheads and the rockers of the 70s thought they killed disco, and now disco's more relevant culturally than rock and roll is, as we sit here in 2022 moving to 2023. So Lizzo, now Lizzo does a lot of things. Lizzo's great. She's dabbles in hip hop, she's got some funk going on here, but she also has disco, and you got come on now. Beyonce was sampling a lot of disco on Renaissance. So everybody is, and you just got some straight up, we're just doing disco. Fuck it. We're going to call it dance music or whatever, but, we have newer synthesizers, we have, more advanced drum machines, but it's disco. So, yeah, so I've been thinking about this one for a while. This has been a fun episode celebrating disco. It's a underrated, underappreciated form of music. It's back very strong and never really kind of shape shifted into something else in the 80s, 90s, but in the 2000s, it started coming back, and now it's just like it's very strong. So anyway, thanks for coming through. Appreciate your support. Hit the like button, subscribe to the channel. I got 4 albums, and we'll have a 5th one coming out soon. It's all here on YouTube. I also have, signed all the streaming services, and I also have a science fiction fantasy, 2 novels, and a novella on Amazon. So check out my creative endeavors. Appreciate you coming through, and see you next episode.